haven't even played real baseball, and the Mets have dealing with 2 injuries to their rotation. Welcome back into the Bleav in Mets podcast. Chris Schubert, Jack McKessie here with you. Not the episode of the pod that we were expecting to have, as spring training should all be about the vibes. The vibe should be immaculate. Juan Soto is hitting home runs in his first ABs. He's giving a car to Brett Beatty. The vibes couldn't have been more immaculate. And now we've had 2 pitching injuries that could derail the start of the season for the New York Mets. Jack, how are you, my friend?
I'm all right, Chris. I mean, Juan Soto showed up to Mets camp, and like you said, vibes could not have been better. I was sending all of the pictures I could find to my friends back at home who are all Nats fans, getting a deluge of dislikes for the message I was sending. And I got hit with some immediate karma with
So it's your
what
fault.
has happened in the days since.
Okay,
we can theorize that it is my fault, but the rotation right now is, if we didn't have question marks before, Chris, which we did, we certainly would have some now.
Yeah, it means you have to have some trust in David Stearns, and I know you have some trust in BetOnline, the world's most trusted betting platform and your number one source for online betting in 2025. Whether you're a seasoned fan or a first-time bettor, BetOnline is your ultimate game day companion with the largest selection of odds on everything from NBA and college basketball to the NHL and UFC. BetOnline continues to be your number one sports betting source. From every three-pointer to hat trick, BetOnline has you covered with odds, stats, and more for every game, every play, and every win. BetOnline, the game starts here. I remember sending you the video of Juan Soto showing up to spring training and him just saying, "Hi, everybody." And I sent to you, making this my new ringtone immediately, just because the smile on his face, the vibes were immaculate, and it was a great start to camp. Like seeing Juan Soto in Mets colors and in the Mets uniform, it still feels surreal. And
it doesn't feel real at all.
We have been given the ultimate dose of bringing us back to what has become our norm and our reality as Mets fans, and that's injuries. Now, I think we're going to take on a different tone than a lot of other people are taking with this. I don't think this is as catastrophic as others are making it out to be. I don't think this requires a knee-jerk, immediate reaction, emergency signing of Jose Quintana, and we'll get into all of that. But we do need to start, and we'll start with Frankie Montas. We'll go in order. Frankie Montas shut down for the next 6 to 8 weeks as he is dealing with some injuries, I believe, to his elbow, that is going to keep him sidelined for the next 6 to 8 weeks. Got a PRP injection and is going to miss some time while he recovers from his injury. And so that was spot number 1 in the rotation that opened up with Frankie Montas going down, and he was listed to be one of the key contributors to this rotation. It was going to be Kodai Senga, it was going to be David Peterson, and then it was going to be some combination of Sean Manaea, Clay Holmes, Frankie Montas at the back end of this rotation. And now Frankie Montas going to miss the next 6 to 8 weeks, and that's before he could even start a spring training throwing program. So we're talking end of May, June, before Frankie Montas could potentially pitch for the Mets this season. So a tough blow. It was a lat injury, not an elbow injury. I'm mixing up my pitching injuries across baseball right now. But it was a lat injury for Frankie Montas that's going to have him out for the next 6 to 8 weeks.
Yeah, I mean, the thing with the Montas injury was going into this spring training and going into the season, Frankie Montas by himself was already a pretty significant question mark because we talked about it when the Mets signed him. Again, a relatively short-term deal. I think 3 years, if that's right, Chris. But
Frankie Montas, 2-year deal.
2-year deal. So
yeah, 2-year deal.
And we weren't sure how he was going to look because he wasn't the sexiest name that was available this offseason in terms of starting pitching. We knew that he was going to be more of a depth, maybe 3, 4, 5 starter in this rotation. And we didn't really get to see any of what he looked like with the Mets. We didn't get to see any of the work that he was putting in the offseason. We didn't get to see anything that Jeremy Hefner got to work on with him going into spring training.
No work from the lab.
Zero work in the lab. And it's frustrating, I'm sure, for him. And it really makes me a little bit more concerned about what his full season projections are going to look like. Because, as you mentioned, Chris, this is not a only 6 to 8 week issue, right? Because now he has to start his ramp up 6 to 8 weeks later and essentially having a delayed spring training into the start of the season. And if the Mets need him quicker, they're going to try to expedite that potentially. And that can cause a whole other problem, a lot of other problems. We saw it last season with what Blake Snell and Jordan Montgomery look like out of their abbreviated spring training and ramp up because they signed so late. So I don't know what this means for Frankie Montas. It just makes the question mark next to his name in the rotation a little bit bigger for me going into this season.
He made 30 starts last year across 2 teams in 2024, but before that, it was 1 start in 2023. It was it was 1 game in 2023. It was no starts. It was 8 starts in 2022 with the Yankees. It was 19 starts with the A's in 2022. So it was 27 total starts in 2022. The last time he had a 30-start season, you have to go back to 2021, and he was going to try for the first time in his career go back-to-back years with 30-plus starts, but his health has been a question mark. It was a question mark when he got to New York. It was a question mark when he got to Milwaukee. It was a question mark when the Mets signed him. Is this really the guy that you're going to have as your number 3 starter behind Senga and Manaea that's going to be your workhorse? Because Clay Holmes is a question mark. David Peterson had a good year last year. How does he follow that up? A lot of question marks in the back end of this this rotation, and we talked about this when these moves were made of, okay, you are asking us to believe in David Stearns and to believe in Jeremy Hefner and to believe in the pitching lab. And there's enough of a track record with what they did with Sevy and with Manaea to warrant at least a little bit of a belief. And this isn't the pitching lab's fault, but here we are already being confronted with a test of this team's depth to where Griffin Canning and Tyler McGill might be making starts the first time through the rotation. And that's not in line with the methodology of we're trying to win a World Series. Like, I don't think a team that has Griffin Canning and Tyler McGill making starts for them is a World Series bound team. So it's tough to really kind of sit back and take this information and take these injuries in and it make you excited for the season to begin. It's almost kind of a dread, despite Juan Soto being here, of, oh no, here we go again. Season hasn't even started yet, and we're dealing with these injuries. Now, listen, David Stearns set up the depth for this team in this way, right? It's why he signed Griffin Canning. It's why Tyler McGill is still here. I saw Blade Tidwell hit 99 today during a spring training start. Don't worry, I'm paying attention everywhere. And we're going to have a Brendan Sproat conversation here in a second. That was injury news number 1, and that was bad enough. And there was a lot of calls of get Jose Quintana on the phone, call up the Padres for Dylan Cease, make trade for Jordan Montgomery or Marcus Stroman. I mean, everybody just coming out of the woodworks with their suggestion on what the Mets should do. And honestly, have you watched David Stearns work? Have you watched him operate? Panic is not a word in David Stearns' vocabulary. He is not going to be dissuaded with his plan. And he built this team in a way where he's got 5 or 6 guys after the 5 guys that are supposed to be in the rotation that he's going to go to first. Well, Sean Manaea getting hurt, having an oblique injury, and needing to miss a couple of weeks. Their expectation there is that he's going to start the year on the IL, but they don't expect him to need any injections or any surgery or anything like that. But he has an oblique strain, and the expectation is that he is going to start on IL, meaning opening day is up for grabs. It will not be Sean Manaea making his start. Our ace will not be starting on opening day for the New York Mets. It'll be somebody else. And now with Manaea out, and he's going to miss maybe 1 or 2 times through the rotation. Frankie Montas going to miss through June, or at least the beginning of May, potentially makes his first start in June. The calls for a rotation addition grow, and the person that is square in the middle of the conversation is Jose Quintana.
Yeah, I don't know about the Quintana thing just yet, but the difference between the injury to Frankie Montas and the injury to Sean Manaea is where Frankie Montas was a question mark and kind of an unknown quantity as far as what he was going to bring to the Mets. We saw what Sean Manaea brought to the Mets in 2024. We saw the impact that he had as the bona fide ace of
hashtag our ace. I mean, I don't know if it was this pod, but I don't see anybody else using hashtag our ace to refer to Sean Manaea. Like, it is a gimmick here on this show. We refer to him as hashtag our ace. Like, we love Sean Manaea. Like, we love him.
But like, I mean, look at the numbers, right? Like, they speak for themselves when you look at what he was doing in the second half of last season and the early part of the playoff run and game 2 of that NLCS. I mean, Sean Manaea's impact on the 2024 Mets cannot be understated. He was such a phenomenal and key piece to the rotation. And, you know, when the Mets re-signed Manaea, we expected, you know, we've joked that he's our ace, but given Senga's lack of starts last year and what the rest of the rotation looked like, we assumed that Sean Manaea was going to be the opening day starter. He was going to be the number 1 guy on this staff, And now to not only lose some of your back end depth in the rotation with Montas, but to lose your number 1 guy, at worst number 1B, really makes things get shaken up a little bit and really test the depth that Stearns, yes, has worked to build in the last couple of seasons. You mentioned Griffin Canning. We've seen Tyler McGill even last season. Paul Blackburn was an acquisition halfway through last season who had another year of team control, and so he's part of the depth in the rotation as well, as far as guys that have played at the major league level. And then you have to go look at guys like Brandon Sproat, who you mentioned, or Bleav Tidwell, who are still in the minors, haven't made their debuts yet. But as more and more injuries start to happen to guys all across the rotation, you start to wonder how long before some of those minor league guys get bumped up further and further in the depth chart. So it really, the Manaea one stung a lot.
Yeah, of course.
And it just leaves me feeling really uncertain. I just don't know if Quintana is the answer right now.
Here is the state of the Mets rotation going into 2025 as it sits after these two injuries. Kodai Senga is your ace, made one start last year. We will always have that one start, but it was one start last year.
We'll always have that one start.
We always have that one start. David Peterson is your number 2. Had a great year last year. The only thing that I could say as a negative to David Peterson is you got to show it to me again. But that's the only knock on David Peterson. He had an excellent year last year. Started that incredibly important game against Milwaukee in the final series of the year before the Braves that the Mets absolutely had to have, and he dominated for 7 innings. Right. So David Peterson's your number 2. Your number 3 is Clay Holmes, who is a reliever that you're trying to make into a starter. Now, I will tell you, he looked good in those 3 innings that he worked in spring training, so I'm a little excited to see what this looks like. But that's your number 3 starter. Your number 4 starter is Paul Blackburn, who had to have surgery for his spine because there was fluid in his spine. So there's your number 4 starter. And your number 5 starter is Griffin Canning, who, no offense to Griffin Canning, should be nowhere near a World Series rotation. That's where the Mets are at right now. Like, that's the state of their rotation. So I understand why. McGill, potentially Tidwell, right? All these options, right?
Right.
And so I understand why people are clamoring for Jose Quintana. And I said this on Twitter because I was getting into it with some people who were championing for Quintana. And here's what I said. I quote tweeted somebody in baseball Twitter, in Mets Twitter land, Jared Seidler, who works for Baseball Prospectus. And I quote tweeted something he talked about with Quintana. And I said, we hear Stearns talk all the time about keeping roster flexibility for young position players. I'd assume that extends to pitchers as well. And if Sproat is part of their plans this year, and I put in parentheses, he should be, they won't want to landlock a spot. You sign Jose Quintana. You're going to pay him, you're not paying him $2 million. You're not paying him $4 million. You're probably paying him $8, $10, $12 million on a 1-year deal. So then that means Jose Quintana's got to be a part of your rotation. Like, Steve Cole's got a lot of money. He doesn't have, we're going to pay somebody a $12 million contract to make 3 starts for us and then cut him. Because that's what you're asking Jose Quintana to do, to fill Sean Manaea's spot in the rotation 2 or 3 times through. And then Manaea comes back and you feel a little bit better about the rotation. To me, I would rather piece it together with Canning, McGill, Tidwell, or truthfully, if we're being just honest here, I said this to you after the Montas injury happened. I don't know why we're not having a realistic conversation about Brandon Sproat at 24 years old making this team and being the 5th starter. He's better than Griffin Canning. He's better than Tyler McGill. He's better than Tidwell. He is the 5th best option for this baseball team. He should just make the opening day roster and be a starter for them.
I think you're right. I am on the same page as you as far as I think the Quintana signing is, or the idea of a Quintana signing would be a sign of panic and uncertainty about the depth in pitching on an organizational level, right? Because Brandon Sproat would be that next man up if there were, God forbid, one more injury to a Blackburn or a Canning or a McGill or Peterson, Senga, etc. So to have Quintana signed to a pretty significant contract, like you said, locks up a spot in the rotation, and assuming he stays healthy, he'll be just good enough that the Mets won't really be able to, move on from him in any way. And he probably won't be good enough to warrant a return in a trade deadline situation. So it puts the Mets in a really awkward position as far as their pitching development and what they want to see from guys like Brandon Sproat and Bleav Tidwell and Nolan McLean. Name anyone that you want in the minors right now, because there are strong pieces, there are strong prospects that could come up and contribute very soon as this year, especially with all of these injuries. And again, as bad as the injuries feel for Manaea and for Frankie Montas, at the end of the day, they're only going to miss like a month max, maybe combined, and like a few starts. We're not dealing with a Tommy John situation where we're going to need a bona fide guy like Jose Quintana who's going to need to fill a spot for 25 plus starts. Instead, there are spots that need to be filled early, and it's a very easy spot to envision Brandon Sproat making the team. Very low pressure, low stakes. Let's see what you can do in these early months against some teams that aren't going to be part of a gauntlet down the road, and see how you perform at the major league level. And if things go well, great. He earned a spot in the rotation, and the Mets can move forward and go to a 6-man or whatever when Montas and Manaea come back.
Anthony DiComo tweeted a little bit after the news of Sean Manaea more than likely heading towards the IL. So without Sean Manaea and Frankie Montas, the Mets figured to open the season with a rotation of Kodai Senga, Clay Holmes, David Peterson. The final 2 spots will be some combination of Paul Blackburn, Griffin Canning, and Tyler McGill. And this is the thing that I want to make sure that listeners of this pod understand in this moment is, if during the season, if this was May or this was June and Sean Manaea was going to miss 2 or 3 turns through the rotation, they would just go to Paul Blackburn, Griffin Canning, or Tyler McGill.
Yep.
If Frankie Montas made his first start of the year and then was going to get shut down for 6 to 8 weeks because something didn't feel right in his lat, Paul Blackburn, Griffin Canning, and Tyler McGill would make those starts. Because this is happening in the spring, there is sort of this natural reaction to, well, you have all this time. Go get somebody. Go sign somebody. Go trade for somebody. This is the Mets signed Griffin Canning. They brought back Paul Blackburn. They didn't trade Tyler McGill. They kept him on the roster. Why? Because these are the guys they're going to turn to. These are the guys they're going to turn to first. And truthfully, it's all in service to buy time for Brandon Sproat. That's all it is. They're just buying time for when they feel he's ready, and they might feel he's ready through spring and say, you know what, put him in the rotation because we don't have a choice. But this idea that they're going to go out and spend $10, $12 million on Jose Quintana, I'm sorry, I think it's a fever dream. Now, you tell me that all of a sudden you can get a team-friendly deal for Dylan Cease? Now, that's different. Dylan Cease is somebody that actually makes an impact when Manaea is back, right, when Frankie Montas is back.
Right.
That's different. That's a different animal. Jose Quintana would be a placeholder. He would be a 3-start placeholder. What's good baseball business? Signing Jose Quintana to make 3 starts for you and overpaying him for those 3 starts, or trying to piecemeal it together with Paul Blackburn, Griffin Canning, and Tyler McGill? It's clear what the right option is. It's clear. And I know it hurts, but if this is the rotation that they're going to have all year, then they're not going to make the playoffs. They're not going to make a run and go to the World Series. But it's not. It's at most the rotation for a month and a half. Sean Manaea is expected. They haven't even actually put him on the injured list yet. They actually haven't given a timetable on when he's going to return because it's still up in the air. The story that I'm reading, it says likely to miss opening day. They won't even say it's certainty that he's going to miss opening day. So they say he's unlikely to return before mid to late April. That's 2-3 weeks into the season.
Yeah.
We're talking 2 or 3 starts. I'm not going to completely upend my entire offseason plan for 2 or 3 starts. This is why David Stearns is in the position he's in, and this is why we are podcasters and we have a podcast and people are fans and they just tweet about things. That's the difference.
Yeah. I mean, what I think about for what's going on right now, and it's obviously very easy to overreact, but when you take a step back and you think about what we've been saying all offseason, David Stearns has a plan. There is a reason that he's liked Griffin Canning enough to sign him, despite what some of the metrics said about the home runs he was giving up or the walks that he was allowing and whatever, his ERA not being great. There's a reason that he brought in Paul Blackburn with an extra year of team control in a trade last season. There's a reason that there are guys like Max Kranick and Tyler Zuber on the roster, right? Because these are players that Stearns and Jeremy Hefner saw something in from a developmental perspective. And when push comes to shove, if one of those guys has to make 2 or 3 starts to fill in for an injured guy in the ideal starting rotation, let's say, they can do that. Right. We should have faith that David Stearns had a vision, and there's a reason that he brought in the depth that he did on the deals that he did, because there is something there. There is something to work with. We shouldn't hit the panic button on Jose Quintana just because he's an established name that we're familiar with as Mets fans. And that's what I think a lot of people are doing is, well, I've never heard of Griffin Canning or seen any of his starts. What about Jose Quintana? Remember how good he was down the stretch last year? Why don't we add him and he can bolster the rotation? No, David Stearns knew what he was doing when he built the rotation the way he did, and he had the depth to fill the spots when he needs to, and right now he does need to, obviously. So I'm not freaking out about an injury that's going to take away from the rotation in the early parts of the season right now. And I also want to say, going into last season, if you had told me that a rotation that consisted of Luis Severino and Sean Manaea with no Kodai Senga for all but 1 start last year, and you said with that rotation, the Mets make it to the NLCS and within 2 games of the World Series,
right,
I would have called you insane.
Right.
So, there's reason to believe in David Stearns and his process, and the depth is being tested early, but we're going to see the returns early as well.
Griffin Canning was brought here to be an injury replacement if somebody got hurt. It just so happens that it's happening before the season begins. Now, if Sean Manaea needed to have Tommy John surgery and was out for the entirety of the year, that's a different conversation. It's a different conversation if Frankie Montas and Sean Manaea are both unavailable for the entire year.
Or even like 2 to 3 months instead of what it is now.
Right. If both of those guys aren't available until after the All-Star break, we're having a different conversation. But
100%.
We're talking mid to late April for Sean Manaea. Like, that's all we're talking about, 2 or 3 turns through the rotation. And you know what? If it means a quicker march for Brandon Sproat to the big leagues, I'm on board. Get Brandon Sproat to the big leagues as soon as possible. I'm all in on Brandon Sproat. One more piece of injury news that we'll get to here is Nick Madrigal, who was in line to be the Jose Iglesias of this year. I don't know if he was going to release a pop hit, but he was supposed to replace Jose Iglesias on this roster as the utility infielder. Will not be doing so. Dislocated his left shoulder. Fractured it in that game on Sunday against the Nationals. The quote from Carlos Mendoza is he's going to be, quote, out for a long time, end quote. That's never good when you aren't putting a timetable on it and then you say out for a long time. So it is Acuna. It is new swing, new number, new year, new me, Brett Beatty. It is Jared Young, Luis De Los Santos, and Donovan Walton, at least according to this Anthony DiComo piece that will be competing for that open bench spot.
I think this is a very interesting conversational transition we can make from the pitching side of things and what some people are saying as far as a panic button and what I think the Mets are actually going to do. So obviously, as soon as Nick Madrigal got hurt, what did we see?
Jose Iglesias. Gotta get him back.
OMG, bring him back.
Get him back.
Here's the thing, guys and girls and everyone listening. The Mets have a lot of depth on the infield from young guys that can and have contributed at the major league level, namely Luis Angel Acuna, namely Brett Beatty. And when it comes to figuring out what they're going to do about their infield depth and their bench, because again, Nick Madrigal wasn't going to be a starter. Jeff McNeil was going to take second base, Vientos at third, obviously Lindor at shortstop, and Pete at first. They just needed extra depth. And Brett Beatty and Luis Angel Acuna are, in my opinion, better fits for the opening day roster. I'm sorry to Nick Madrigal, but to have young guys get the chance to contribute at the major league level is much more important for their development than an aging veteran who, frankly, has had his issues with injuries. Now, Nick Madrigal, I'm sorry to you. I don't know you. I'm sure you're a great guy, but this could also, like with the rotation, like what we said with Brandon Sproat coming up and contributing early, this could be for the best for guys like Acuna and guys like Beatty who need to get more reps at the major league level, and this provides them the chance to do that by making the roster.
Yeah, Madrigal is going to be the veteran, been around the big leagues, been around the block, had a cup of coffee with multiple different teams, is able to thrive in that utility role. That was what he was supposed to be, right? I think in an ideal world, the Mets are giving Luis Angel Acuna everyday playing time somewhere, whether it's in AAA or whether it's at the big league level. I don't think they want to take a 20-something-year-old kid and say, hey, you're a bench piece, you're going to play one every 5 days, and you're going to pinch it off the bench. That's not ideal. But if Nick Madrigal can't go because he fractured his shoulder, then somebody's got to step up. And it's got to be Beatty. It's got to be Acuna. It's got to be somebody else on this roster that opens up, that takes that opportunity that's been opened up and runs with it. And if it's Acuna, great. We saw what he was able to do in the last couple of weeks of the season. If it's Beatty, because he changed his swing looks really good. I'll say it. Swing looks a lot better. He's lifting the ball a lot more. Then so be it, right? That's a good thing, at least from that perspective of the young player development. You hate to see a player get injured, and I would have loved to have seen what Nick Madrigal brought to this team as a veteran utility player. It feels like the bench is always something that the Mets in past regimes have kind of forgotten about, and it feels like the one thing David Stearns prioritizes is I'm going to have a bunch of guys that could be bench players for me. And so he brought in Nick Madrigal to be this year's Jose Iglesias, but he's got Acuna, he's got Beatty. Ronnie Mauricio could potentially see some time in the second half of the year in that spot, depending on how everybody else does. So again, injuries suck. These 3 players not being able to help the New York Mets this year, or at least for parts of this year, is not a good thing. But this is where you really see the fruits of the labor that is David Stearns and what he's trying to do here, is that there are in-house options that, while maybe not the best, because I'm sorry, nobody can have 10 to 12 really good starting pitching options, they're prepared for this where they don't have to go out and make an immediate panic signing of somebody because they have options in-house that they want to give a shot.
Unless you're the Dodgers, then you have 10 to 12
You have,
really
yeah,
good
you have
starting
14 starting pitching options for before the start of the year.
But
Yeah.
again, like, not that the Mets are the Dodgers level yet, but look at what the Dodgers had to do last year, right? They had 2 rotations worth of injuries at starting pitcher. They didn't go out and sign guys. They did make some trades, but they were able to call up guys from the minors and make contributions early. And
They
that's
started-
the kind of level of development from a pitching standpoint, from a farm system standpoint, that the Mets are trying to emulate and build sustained success.
If I remember correctly, they had an opener in a World Series game.
Yeah, they sure did.
So it's, you can build a rotation as great as they come. But David Stern says it all the time. The roster that you have at the beginning of the year is not the roster you have at the end of the year. These rosters go through life cycles. These rosters go through evolutions throughout the course of the year. One more quick thing before we get out of here. On Wednesday, we're going to drop our 26-man roster projection now with these new injuries and everything. So Jack and I will each come to the table with what we think the 26-man roster will be. I do want to give a quick shout out, and he is somebody that I think is maligned at times in Mets media world for some of the things that he reports, but I think his writing is really good, and I'm going to shout out this piece because if you haven't seen it, I highly recommend you going to see it. Andy Martino dropped the story today of Juan Soto going through the at-bat against the Guardians in the playoffs where he hit the home run, and it's Soto breaking down each pitch of the at-bat. It is an absolute excellent read, and if you didn't love Juan Soto already, you're going to read that story and go, I am so glad that Juan Soto is on my baseball team. I read it right before we went on the air here. Highly, highly recommend you seek out that piece on SNY. .com. But that's going to do it for us. We're back on Wednesday. 3 episodes for you this week. So this episode talking about the Mets rotation. We will have a projections episode about the roster on Wednesday, and who knows what Friday will bring to us. Maybe we'll react to some of the things we've seen so far in spring. But that's going to do it for us. As always, you can find the show wherever you get your podcast. Please rate, review, subscribe. That helps us out a bunch. You can see the video version of the show on YouTube. Just Jack McKessy, McKessy. That's going to do it for us here on today's edition of the Bleav in Mets podcast. And as always, let's go Mets.
Let's go Mets.